Hi guys, we're going to talk today a little bit about chapter 2 of Mice and Men. First thing I want to go over with you guys is the new characters that are introduced. And the first one that you meet is Candy. We were told right away that he's a swamper, which means he's a janitor. He is missing one hand because he lost it in a ranch accident. He talks more about that later on. He's very social. He tends to gossip. He is trying to make a connection with anyone that he can. He also gives the new guys, when they come in, sort of the lay of the land and lets them know who's who and what's what on the ranch. We meet the boss very briefly. He doesn't stick around long, and it's the only time we ever see him for any length whatsoever in the story. We're told when he first enters, before we know who he is, we're told how he's dressed, and that's a big clue that he's the boss, because he's dressed better than most of the men on the ranch. He's clearly not a laborer. He is suspicious of George. He can pick up on the fact that Lenny is feeble-minded, and he believes that the reason that the two men are traveling together is because George is taking Lenny's money, because it's not normal for men to go from ranch to ranch together. Usually they are loners in this time period especially, so it's really unusual to see two guys traveling together, and the boss is just questioning that and if there's some ulterior motive. You'll see later that the boss isn't the only one that points out that it's unusual for two people to travel together, and that's more evidence of the fact that George and Lenny have a special relationship, like that they're almost like brothers. And so even if George is mean, and we talked about this in the last video, even if George is mean to Lenny, it doesn't mean he doesn't care about him. We also meet Curly. He is the boss's son, and he is the antagonist of the story. He's described as being strong but not very tall, and he compensates for his lack of height by trying to pick fights on bigger guys. So the instant he sees Lenny, he immediately takes on this fighting stance physically, like the way he's standing changes, and he talks very aggressively to Lenny. He's looking to pick a fight. And therefore, George tells him that Lenny needs to steer clear of Curly, because he's afraid if they get in a fight, then George and Lenny are going to be out of a job. And then when he meets Curly's wife later, he's even more concerned about that. And that's the next character that we need to talk about, is Curly's wife. She's never named in the story. We never know what her name is, and that's something we will talk about in later chapters. But our initial impression of her is not positive. First of all, Candy calls her a tart. He says that she's got the eye, meaning she's always checking out other men. And he doesn't have a very high opinion of her. He's very negative when he characterizes her for the other guys. And then when we see her, she definitely comes across as very flirtatious and interested in talking to anybody that'll listen to her. George, again, really says to Lenny, stay away from her. He indicates that he thinks she's trouble, and when you couple that with the fact that he's worried about a fight with Curly, that explains why George is concerned about Lenny talking to Curly's wife in any way, because this would just be another reason for Curly to fight Lenny. We also meet Slim, and Slim is not an incredibly important character. He doesn't get a ton of focus in the story, but there are some qualities about Slim that are important to point out. We're told, first of all, that he's the jerk line skinner. That means that he is the guy that drives the mule teams. So he can handle very large teams of mules with a great expertise, is what we're told, that he's very good at his job. He's also compared to royalty. We're told he's like a master craftsman. He's the prince of the ranch, and he has authority so great that his word was taken on any subject. He's kind and understanding. So when the other men talk about Slim, you get a very positive impression of him and who he is. And you'll see later that he's the guy that everybody always turns to when they need advice on anything. And sort of his word is gold for them. And then last character that we meet in this chapter is Carlson, who's another one of the ranch hands. And he's an even less important character than Slim is. And we're told that he does not like Candy's dog hanging around. And it's not because Candy's dog in and of itself is a bad dog, but it's old and it smells bad. Now, Carlson tries to make it sound better by talking about how, that dog can't eat anything. He's lost his teeth. He's practically blind. And he makes it sound like his concern is more humanitarian for the dog. But in reality, he just doesn't like that it smells bad. So Carlson is a very selfish character. One thing about all of the characters in Of Mice and Men is that they are archetypes. And an archetype is kind of what it sounds like. It's a type of character that you see often in many works of literature. And Carlson sort of is a stand-in for anyone who's considered selfish and only concerned with himself, whereas Slim is sort of the heroic character and is the one that everybody respects and looks up to. George, in terms of archetypes, is an everyman character, which means he's just your ordinary average guy that is dealing with the same kinds of things that any ordinary average guy would be dealing with. And then he finds himself in an extraordinary situation where he has to make a difficult choice, which is another thing that happens to everyday people every once in a while. So I want to talk about the questions on your rap sheet just a little bit, some of the trickier ones. I've covered some of the information that's on here already, but just to reemphasize a couple of these other questions, I've really covered 1 through 3 already, but when it comes to Carlson, he suggests that Slim give Candy a puppy because Slim's dog has had puppies, and the reason he suggests this is so that they can euthanize, for lack of a better term. Actually, euthanize is the nice term, right? The mean term would be they want to take Candy's dog out and shoot it because Carlson doesn't like having the dog around anymore, and he thinks, we can just replace one dog with another. And Carlson doesn't understand the loyalty and the love that is between Candy and this old dog. And that's a really important thing to remember. And we're going to hear more about the dog, but this dog that was unable to really care for itself very well anymore and had a poor quality of life, and whether or not it should be euthanized. Just remember that and keep it in mind for later in the book. The only other question I asked you about was the stable book. And he's not talked about very much, but what we do know is the men don't want him around. And he is kind of forced to be apart from the rest of them, and that's because he's black. And we're talking about 1930s America. Racism was rampant. And so these characters talk about Crooks in a very disparaging way. We haven't met him yet, so we don't really know anything about him. And that's really when you can form an opinion about him. But Steinbeck, he portrayed people the way they really were, and because racism was so common, you really see that with this one black character that's in the story, the fact that he is isolated and marginalized because of the color of his skin. And that's all I have for chapter 2. Keep reading. Make sure you're getting your assignments done and turning them in on Class Kick if you can. If not, you can take pictures and email them to me. Let me know if you have questions, and I hope you're all doing really well. Thanks.